The president of Vascular Sciences, an education, training, and consulting company offering a broad range of services to medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies. He received his BS, MS, and PhD degrees in biomedical engineering from Iowa State University. And he is an internationally recognized expert and featured keynote speaker on cutting-edge medical technology and regulatory affairs. He conducts seminars and talk courses for medical device, pharmaceutical, and biotechnology companies, the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Health Canada, U.S. and European plant offices, U.S. Centers for Medicare and Medicare Services, and other regulatory government agencies. Please welcome Michael Drews.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, everyone, for the opportunity to chat with you a bit this afternoon. I'm going to talk on one of my favorite subjects and one of the least talked about subjects I find in the regulatory field, and that is what I call competitive regulatory strategy. And I'll talk more about what that means to me in just a moment, because what it means to me may be a little different than what it might mean to some of you. Peter did a great job of sharing with you some of my background, so I'm not going to reiterate that. I just do want to reiterate one thing. In addition to spending most of my time working in industry and helping to bring medical products to market, I also spend part of my time working as a consultant for FDA as well as Health Canada. And the reason why I point that out is because there are not a lot of folks that, quite frankly, can say that work on both sides of that proverbial fence. And because of that, I don't want to say it makes me unique, but certainly uncommon in the sense that I see a lot of these issues from both sides. And I can't help but chime in as we get started this afternoon. One of the things that was discussed a little bit about following the previous presentation was, expectations from the FDA and so on. Oftentimes people say to me, Mike, you work as a consultant for FDA. If we came to FDA and asked a certain question or, blah, 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 how do you think they would respond? And more often than not, I will just turn the table right around on them. Put yourself in the shoes or in the chair of the reviewer. If this issue, if this product, if this question came in front of you, what would you expect? Let me let you in on a little secret, and this is not the subject of this afternoon's talk. The FDA doesn't know any more or any less than you do. They went to the same schools, they read the same publications, they go to the same meetings. Perhaps they know a little more about your competitors' products than you do, but after all, you should know a heck of a lot more about your product than they do. Why? Because you are supposed to be an expert on your particular product. They have to be, or at least try to be, an expert on many different kinds of products. I hear a lot of folks, kind of bashing on FDA and this and that and the other thing. And believe me, I will bang on them whenever I think they need to be banged on. But I will also at the same time defend them when I think they need to be defended. And one of my friends who used to be a senior reviewer at CDRH was fond of saying, physicians can kill patients one at a time, but an FDA reviewer can kill patients thousands at a time. And quite frankly, that is something that I think more folks in our industry need to keep in mind. So do yourself a favor, a little free consulting advice, take it for what you paid for it. If you have a question or an issue and you're not sure how FDA is going to respond, put yourself in their chair. If this was coming, across your desk, what would you see? What would you think? What would you question? And so on and so on. Anyway, let me continue on and get to the subject matter. For those that are interested, I'm actually doing 3 presentations this afternoon. This is my second of 3. I did one this morning across the hall on the future of biomedical applications in 3D printing, which was a lot of fun. And suffice it to say, I didn't talk about the stuff that people are doing in 3D printing today. That's boring. I talked about printing, the really cool stuff like printing implantable devices, like printing drugs, new molecular entities. Think that's Star Trek-y? Absolutely not. We're working on that right now. Like printing living tissue. Some of the, what some people are now referring to as bioprinting. And if you think the obvious application of that is for organ transplant, that any monkey can think of that. But what about turning the way we do drug clinical trials totally upside down? Totally upside down. So the regulation for those technologies. Again, that was a previous talk, but we don't have, in my opinion, a sufficient or an adequate regulatory pathway to address personalized medicine, whether it's personalized medicine for medical devices or personalized medicine for drugs, it's going to take a drastically different way to think. But anyway, that's the subject of my previous presentation. This presentation is on competitive regulatory strategy, and for those that are real gluttons for punishment, if you come back this afternoon after the break, I'm going to be giving another presentation on the PMA. I was asked to fill in just 3 days ago for somebody else that was not able to be here. Okay, so if you're interested in a copy of the handout that goes along to this presentation or even the podcast, feel free to give your business card, or probably the best thing is to just connect with me on LinkedIn. You can go to tinyurl.com/mdrews-LinkedIn. It's a little easier to remember that than some ubiquitous URL. Or just, my name, Michael Drews. You can find me on LinkedIn. It's pretty easy to do. And because I do so many presentations, if you just remind me which presentation you attended, in this particular case, competitive regulatory strategy, happy to give that to you. Alrighty, so here's what I'd like to talk about in the next few minutes. First of all, what is competitive regulatory strategy? A quick review on the various medical device pathways to market, because there are a lot of them. A heck of a lot more than just the 510K and the PMA. We're going to look at some case studies, because I find the approach that most people take to learning regulation by reading regulation is boring. I mean, let's be honest. Reading regulation is about as exciting as watching paint dry. I think I would rather watch paint dry than reading the CFR or even guidance. Because I have a medical background and I teach medicine, I'm a huge fan of the case study approach. So let's learn regulation in the context of real products. Sometimes when I give presentations, people say, well, what's the best way to learn about regulatory affairs or regulatory science, if there is such a thing? And that's a topic of a different discussion. Some people say, well, you can read the regulation, you can take a class, you can go to a talk like this. Yeah, you can do all those things, but my recommendation is very simple. Just keep your eyes open to the world in which we live. In other words, when FDA approves a product that you think is particularly interesting for whatever reason, find out how that product was brought to market. But don't just stop there. Any monkey can do that. Once you find out how the product was brought to the market, you at the same time have to figure out, well, what alternative pathways did they have that they didn't use? And why did they not use them? It's kind of like the medical equivalent of studying anatomy. Anybody that studies anatomy is boring, to put it politely. But if you study physiology and pathophysiology, you will learn anatomy at the same time. So if you watch how products are brought to market, you'll learn the regulation at the same time. And I'll wrap this up at the end with a few final thoughts, and then we'll take a break. So let's dig into this a little bit more. First of all, before we can talk about competitive regulatory strategy, I have to talk just a little bit about regulatory strategy. What is regulatory strategy? This is not what most people think. Most people think regulatory strategy means how did you bring your product onto the market? 510K, PMA, whatever it is. HDE, CDE, yada, yada, yada. That's the end result of your regulatory strategy. I view this very much like a process. For those of you that know something about clinical trials and informed consent, is informed consent a form or is it a process? Is regulatory strategy a form or is it a process? Not to be self-serving, but when companies invite me to come in and help to get their product onto the market, one of the things that I do is I try to point out to them all of the different regulatory pathways, all of the different options that they have, and the advantages and disadvantages to each and every one, so that they can decide in their particular circumstances which is the best. The end result of all of that is the regulatory strategy. So one of the things that perhaps some of you will come away with is the fact that regulatory strategies does not simply mean, the hoops that you jump through in order to satisfy the 510K requirements or the PMA requirements or whatever the heck it is. Okay, now that brings us to competitive regulatory strategy. Once again, this is not what most people think. Most people think competitive regulatory strategy means how did your competitor get their similar medical device onto the market? To me, that is not competitive regulatory strategy. That is nothing more than following the leader. And that we don't want to do. Competitive regulatory strategy to me, let me say it this way. Anybody, and if I can be a little bold here, any monkey can design a regulatory strategy to get their product onto the market. That is, to have it pass muster at the FDA or Health Canada or whatever part of the globe they happen to be standing on at the time. The real challenge is, How do you design your regulatory strategy, not simply to make sure that you get your product onto the market, but at the same time act as a barrier to entry to your competition, to make it more difficult for your competitors to get their product onto the market? I find it extraordinary in the little over 20 years that I've been working in this field that most regulatory folks, I'm sure present company excluded, but most regulatory folks don't even think in those terms. And I think that is very unfortunate. If you, Angel, if you can click on the little link there that says lead versus follow, thank you. So, interestingly enough, there are a lot of regulatory consultants out there, but there are very few good ones, at least in my opinion. I'm not biased, but at least in my opinion. So how do you become a good one? Or for those of you that are working companies, how do you find a good one? You need to learn when to follow, but more importantly, you need to learn when to lead, because after all, a man who wants to lead the orchestra must first turn his back on the crowd. And one of my frustrations with a lot of folks working in this field is that we have, quite frankly, a whole bunch of sheep. People that all they want to do is follow in somebody else's footsteps. And believe me, I understand the advantages of that from a business perspective, from a technology perspective, even from a psychology perspective. But here's the problem. If you're following in somebody else's footsteps, there's one thing that I can guarantee. You'll never go anywhere new. If you're following in somebody else's footsteps, you'll never go anywhere new. Something to think about. You know, why should we think that just because everybody, got some regulatory training, that everybody is equally as good? I mentioned earlier, I teach medicine as well, among the many things that I do. Every surgeon has graduated from medical school. Does that mean that every surgeon is equally good? Of course not. Can you hit escape, please? Thank you. All right, so I also want to make a disclaimer that I'm going to be sharing with you a couple of examples this afternoon. Some of the most innovative regulatory strategies that I have developed over the years are proprietary. Because when a company asks me to come in and help bring their product onto the market in a very different kind of a way, they're not keen on me going out and telling the rest of the world, i.e. you folks, exactly how I did it. I've been asking a lot of my attorney friends, my IP friends, if there's any way that I can protect a regulatory strategy in the IP sense of the word. I haven't found a solution to that yet. If somebody knows of one, please tell me. But I'm going to try, to the extent that I can, at least make a few suggestions, because this is something that I don't hear practically anybody at RAPS or any of the other organizations, and I work with all of them, DIA, very few people talking about this. Let's just quickly talk about the pathways to market. If you can click on the pathways link, please. Thank you, Angel. I'm going to go through this really quick, but as you all know, there are a number of different pathways that you can bring your medical device onto the market. And I should be careful what I assume, because I'm not convinced that everybody knows this. I mean, you know the first couple, but I'm not sure that you know all of them. So obviously you have two primary choices. The first, of course, is the pre-market notification, or PMN, often referred to as the 510K, based on the very nebulous concept of substantial equivalence. What the heck does that mean? I have no idea. On one hand, I spend much of my time arguing what substantial equivalence is at FDA. On the other hand, I don't. So I think I understand substantial equivalence perhaps a little better than some, but on the other hand, I don't think I understand it at all. I mean, I realize that it's a bit schizophrenic, it's a bit bipolar, but what the heck is that? And of course, the other pathway that we have is the investigational device exemption, followed by the PMA. We'll talk about that a little bit more in my second presentation later this afternoon. Here's a little interesting statistic for you. As you all know, the vast majority of medical devices that we work on today are the lower class kinds of devices, class 1 and class 2. But in terms of economics, the differences between those low versus high are staggering. It costs about $31 million on average to bring a 510K product to the market, as opposed to about 3 times that, $94 million, to bring a PMA device onto the market. Okay, so that's, although it's kind of scary, everybody understands that. Here's the scariest part. More than 3/4 of those costs are directly related to clearing the regulatory requirements. I find that very unfortunate. Very unfortunate. Another thing that I think frustrates me a lot about folks in this industry is we get so caught up on just simply following the regulation that rarely, if ever, do we take a step back and ask, does the regulation make sense? Because if the regulation makes sense, then by all means, let's continue to do it. But if it doesn't make sense and we continue to do it anyway for no other reason than somebody tells us that we have to, is that a problem with the system or is that a problem with us? This is a real problem. I'm being very honest. Some of you might disagree with me, but that's the way I see it. In addition to that, there are other pathways that you really need to understand that are beyond the scope of this presentation today. The Product Development Protocol, or PDP, very seldomly used, but in some cases it might have some advantages. The de novo pathway, I'll give you a quick example of this in a few minutes. It was recently redone by Congress. I've got a webinar coming up on this in a couple of weeks. I gave a presentation at DIA this past summer on the de novo to more than 300 people in the room, and now we're starting to see more people use this pathway for reasons that are beyond the scope of our presentation today. The humanitarian use device, which leads to the HDE, the humanitarian device exemption. This is kind of akin to the orphan drug program on the drug side of the world. And the custom device exemption, or CDE, extremely uncommonly used, but assuming that we do not create a new regulatory pathway, I think the potential for the CDE to be used in the future, especially when you consider things like personalized medicine for medical devices, this is the closest thing that we have. In my opinion, it's not ideal, but it's the closest thing that we have to a current regulatory model for personalized medicine. And the emergency or the compassionate use exemption as well. Bottom line, if you don't understand all of the possible pathways and the advantages and disadvantages of each, then quite frankly, how can you do your job? If it serves your best interest to go down the existing path, to go down to 510K, and the vast majority of devices do, then by all means do it. But don't you think you should at least consider, gee, maybe there are other alternatives out there that might be advantageous for you in certain situations? And how can you evaluate those if you don't even know what they are? And when we get to competitive regulatory strategy, you're going to see examples. Escape, please. Thank you. Okay, so let's look at a couple of case studies. If you can click on the second link, the one that says risk, perfect. So obviously, when we talk about risk, we're thinking of a continuum. And again, this is something that I'm going to talk a little more about in the PMA discussion a little later. But one of the things that a lot of folks like to do is they like to lower their regulatory burden. For example, they say that it's easier to do a 510K as opposed to a PMA, which more often than not it is. I just shared with you some economic statistics. But if you're in the area of this kind of overlap, where it could go either way, right, and you're the first one, so you largely are going to determine the trail. Let's say that you work in a large company. A large company is code speak for having a lot of resources. People, time, money, yada, yada, yada. And your competition are primarily small and startup companies. If you decide to take the path of higher resistance and take the PMA, yes, you are making your jobs more difficult. No question about it. However, who else's jobs are you making more difficult? Your competition. And if your competition are the smaller and the startups, and let me tell you, I spend some of my time working as an entrepreneur, and I do a lot of work with VCs and angels and so on and so on. They are not keen on having to take the PMA route. So if they find out that they thought that their device was going to be a 510K, but now because of you set it, to be PMA, that might be enough for them to pull the funding on the project right there. Very interesting stuff. Similarly for down classification, the de novo is a form of this. I'll talk about it more in a moment. But if you're working on a Class 2 device, and the device has been around for a long time, and there's got a lot of history, yada, 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 and you want to go through down classification to get Class 1 to make your job easier, you can certainly do that. That's an admirable goal. But whose job are you also making easier? Your competition. So before pulling the trigger, again, I'm not saying don't do that. I'm simply saying that when you do that to make your own job easier, you're making your competition's job easier as well. Escape, please. Let's see. Click on that last link there. I'm not sure if we're. Actually, I'm not gonna talk about that in this presentation right now. Let's if there's time, I'll talk about it. Okay, label expansion. I love to put regulatory strategies together in very creative, very innovative ways, right? So if you're not familiar with the HDE, the Humanitarian Device Exemption, one of the interesting things about that regulation, can you click on the middle? Yeah, that one. One of the interesting things there, it's kind of the equivalent to the orphan drug program, if you know what that is. And FDA has put out some guidance in the last couple of years on this. You should definitely take a look. That's your homework. But one of the, and here's another guidance from just a couple of months ago. You need to identify what we call a medically plausible subset. A medically plausible subset of less than 4,000 people per year in the United States. Of course, the devil's in the details. We can add these numbers up a litany of different ways. But as long as your number is 4,000 or less, you might, and again, underscore here, might be able to get your device onto the market under the HUD-HDE path. Okay? Beyond the numbers, now, to most people think, oh gosh, 4,000 people, there's not a lot of money, why would we want to do that? Well, remember that a moment ago when I talk about expanding the label. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a second. But one of the huge attractions to me in the HDE is for most medical applications, not just in devices, but in drugs and biologics and combo products, you are required to show that your product is safe and effective. Right? You all know that. Is that always the case? Absolutely not. There are some important exemptions. There are some important exceptions. You know, so many people think what the regulation says is important. To me, that's just the beginning. What the regulation says, with all due respect to my many friends at FDA, is really not the most important. It's what the regulation doesn't say that is more important. So what is the requirement, or let me say it this way, is there a requirement for efficacy under the HDE? Absolutely not. Instead, we have to show what? Plausible benefit. What the heck does plausible benefit mean? I have no idea, but that's what the regulation says. Why? Because we're trying to incentivize companies to work in areas where financially they would have no incentive. And to be able to do a clinical trial that has enough statistical power in these small populations to show efficacy, you couldn't do it. Now, in reality, is there a difference between efficacy and probable benefit? No. Because is any product 100% effective? Absolutely not. So when we think about the efficacy continuum, and I love to think in terms of continuum, whether it's risk, whether it's efficacy, whatever, it doesn't matter. When you think about the efficacy continuum, so this is very high efficacy and this is very low. Okay? Efficacy, as you folks are used to thinking of it, is probably over here somewhere. Probable benefit is further down here. Simply put, if you qualify, it is easier, less burdensome, if you want to call it that, to get a medical device onto the market under the HDE, escape please, as opposed to the IDE, right? Okay, but this is not going to be an easy thing for you to sell to your organization because they're saying, well, we can only sell 4,000 per year. Absolutely not. See, here's an example of taking advantage of what the regulation does not say. The regulation says 4,000 people per year. Doesn't say how many indications that you can go after. I developed, and I have to be really careful because a lot of the plays that I take out of here in my device work, I steal right out of the drug world. And one of the things that I was involved with doing on the drug side of the world under the orphan program, the orphan case, 200,000 people per year you're limited to. So the limit is higher. We'll talk about why. Again, it doesn't say how many. If you can bring an orphan product onto the market under the orphan designation for 32 different indications, 32 indications times 200,000 people per year, that starts to become attractive. Is that violating the intent of the regulation? Perhaps, but it certainly is not violating the spirit of the law. Now, if you want to have a discussion about maybe we should change the regulation, fine, I'm all for it, let's bring it on. But one of the things that I try to point out to the companies that I work with is all of the options that they have and the advantages and disadvantages of each, and then they can decide. So, the medical device equivalent of this. Let's say you want to make a lot of money, you want to go after a big market, I don't care what area you're working in, there are few markets that are bigger than diabetes. And let's talk about non-insulin dependent diabetes mellitus, NIDDM, so-called type 2 diabetes. I don't know what the number is, but clearly more than 4,000 people, right? Clearly more than that. So you say, Mike, we want to bring this device onto the market for diabetes. We want to do it under the HDE. How can we do that? Well, as long as you can slice and dice this pie such that You can carve out a slice, and you can define it less than 4,000. And again, you can add up these numbers in many different ways. I won't get into that here. As long as you can carve out a slice, a medically plausible subset, less than 4,000 people, you get it onto the market here under the HDE. Remember, probable benefit, no efficacy. And now we do a label expansion to go after, via the PMA, to go after the bigger overall diabetic market. Why is this an advantage? Because, and this is right out of Drug Strategy 101, it is always easier to do a label expansion than to bring a product onto the market originally. It is always easier to do it that way. Right? Again, I don't have time to get into the specific details. If you're interested, see me. I'd be happy to talk to you about that. But that is interesting stuff. Anybody think that's interesting? Coming from Boston, I would say it's wicked cool, but some of you are Californians. I don't know what you know about wicked cool. But anyway, very interesting stuff. How are we doing on time? Okay. So I already talked about the similarities between the HDE and the orphan in the sense there's no limit on the indications. So use that to your advantage. You come up with, this perhaps might be a little excessive, but several dozen. We came up with 32 indications for one particular product. And of course, that's on label. Let's not even talk about off-label use. That's the topic of a whole different. Okay, finally we get to the de novo. Using your classification to your advantage, right? A lot of, and actually if you can click on the last link, the one that says webinar first, thank you. Not to sound self-serving, but because this is a topic that more and more people are at least considering because of the changes, I'm doing a webinar on this just later this month, specifically talking about some of the changes that Congress made just about a year ago in the de novo pathway. Long story short, I think that this pathway, it has not been used very often in the past for reasons I won't get into here. It has the potential to be used a heck of a lot, especially in areas like mobile apps, especially in areas like imaging, and especially in areas like in vitro diagnostics. Those three technologies, mobile apps, imaging, and IVDs. There are others, but those are the big three that I think really have the potential to take advantage of this, and many people are not. Escape, please. And now let's go to the first one, the primer. Thank you. Okay. So normally I have my laptop up here, but in this case, I have my friend Angel in the back that's controlling it for me. So a quick history. The de novo was originally created in 1997. It was a way of trying to increase the efficiency of bringing low-risk medical devices onto the market. It was a reclassification. And basically, the idea, the logic is very simple, right? So if you're coming out with a Band-Aid for the very first time, and there is no other Band-Aid out there on the market, you're coming out with a Band-Aid today, your default classification would be what? Class 3. So in a nutshell, you would be in the same class as the totally implantable artificial heart. Now, it shouldn't take an MD or a PhD or an RAC after somebody's name to appreciate that that's nuts. Who the heck would advocate putting a Band-Aid in the same category as an artificial heart? And so as a result, the de novo was created to lower the class, i.e. lower the risk. And by the way, some of you, were at the presentation this morning on the 510K. In my opinion, the two most important, really the two only important areas of the 510K submission are the substantial equivalent argument and your risk mitigation strategy. I don't care, with all due respect to my many friends at FDA, and I work on both sides of this fence, if you dot all your I's and you cross all your T's, if you don't have a really good substantial equivalence argument, and if you don't have a really good risk mitigation strategy, you're probably not going to be successful, right? Well, in the de novo, there is no substantial equivalent argument. So this comes down to one and only one thing, risk mitigation. And also, please keep in mind, and again, this is beyond the topic of this afternoon's presentation, risk has a lot of different connotations. And you have to mitigate each and every type of risk, not just the most obvious risk, that is the risk of direct harm caused to the patient by using your device, but the risk of the patient not using your device. And in the case of you that are working in, for example, imaging or IVD diagnostics, for example, the risk of providing the wrong information. The risk of telling somebody they have cancer when in fact they don't, or the risk of saying you don't have cancer when in fact you do. So, and those are just 3 examples. Those are what I call my big 3s of risk, but there are more. Okay, so the crux of the de novo is you got to mitigate risk, because basically what you're asking FDA to do is to say, hey, we've got a Band-Aid. It doesn't make sense to put it in the same category as an artificial heart. And as a result, we want to move further to the left on the risk continuum. Here's why we think that's a good idea. Unfortunately, the reason why this has not been used very often in the past is because you had to jump through a whole bunch of hoops. Basically, what you had to do is you had to submit the full-blown 510K. You need to have that rejected. Then you need to go back to FDA and go for the down classification. Yada, yada. It, quite frankly, was a pain in the you-know-what. And as a result, nobody wanted to do it. I can't say that I blame them. Why the heck would you do this? Why not just go through the 510K, sorry, the PMA if you have to and be done with it, right? But now you run into the risk of following regulation that doesn't make any sense, but following it because you think that you'd rather just, follow rather than lead. Anyway, so we don't do it that way anymore. Up until about a year ago, that's the way we did it. Here's some statistics. These are the real statistics. The ideal time FDA required less than 60 months. Realistic time, back in 2006, it was about that, but a few years later, 241 days. What's that? 6, 12, about 4 times longer, right? So as we all know, there's a difference between theory versus reality. Start to finish time, 480 days. Again, now you can start to appreciate why most people didn't want to do this. It was, quite frankly, a pain in the neck. It took too long, roughly 3 times longer than the traditional 510K, and in addition to everything else, FDA was not required to provide updates to you during that process. In my opinion, totally unreasonable. Because, again, not to sound self-serving, but because I work part-time for FDA, I'm down there fairly frequently. One of the things that I can do for some of the folks that I work with is I can just informally, if I bump into somebody in the hallway, hey, John, what's the status of XYZ? You folks don't have the mechanism to do that, but you should. There's no reason why, I mean, if you want to come to me, you can, but there's no reason why you should have to come to somebody like me to do that. Over about a decade, only 54 devices were brought to market under this pathway. That's less than 5 a year, right? Well, this is becoming much more attractive because now Congress, not FDA, this came from Congress, they simplified the whole process. You don't have to go through the 510K submission and have it rejected and yada, yada. You just go right to the chase. This is a form of down classification. You just go and say, hey, I'm bringing a Band-Aid onto the market, but it makes no sense. We're all idiots if we think that Band-Aid should be Class 3. I think it should be moved to Class 2 or to Class 1, and here's why. Escape, and then the second one, please. The second one, yeah, the middle one. But coming back to competitive regulatory strategy, we have to be careful when we do this in the de novo. This is from a friend of mine, and he and I co-presented on this at DIA last year, more than 300 people. And now we've had, in the last 12 months, a 3 times increase in the number of submissions, de novo applications, a 3 times increase in the last 12 months since this was changed. It was changed just because of me, of course not. But people like me talking about this. Anyway, here's what Michael said in this article, and if you want it, I'd be happy to send it to you. A key tactical decision faced in the de novo process is whether to recommend a class for the device. This is optional. You don't have to do it. It's recommended that a manufacturer suggest the class that gives the most control over its destiny. In other words, we're moving from Class 3 down to Class 2 or maybe even to Class 1. For a Class 2 device, it includes trying to influence the type of controls that might be required. So bottom line, this is another example of what I call, but Michael and I are talking about the same thing, competitive regulatory strategy. If you want to set the bar to the lowest point, to go from Class 3 to Class 1, I'm not saying you should not do that. I'm simply suggesting that if you win, yes, you're going to make your job easier, but at the same time, you're going to make your competition's job easier as well. So it may be to your advantage, at least to consider saying to yourself, you know what, I'm pretty confident, I'm pretty confident that I could be successful bringing this down to Class 1, but for competitive reasons, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to bring it to Class 2. That's a business decision. That's a tactical decision. Using regulation to your advantage. That is wicked cool. Escape? Okay. And finally, the last example, using regulation or guidance as a weapon. Can you click on the guidance link, please? Guidance documents, I hope everybody know, are what I call the commentary on the CFR. CFR is about as exciting as watching paint dry. Guidance is not much more exciting, but at least a little bit. Is the CFR binding? Well, I say yes, but. You don't have to do what's in the CFR. But if you're planning on not doing it, you need to have a very strong justification as to why you're not. Is the guidance binding? Most people would say no. I would say no, but. Again, there are very few absolutes in regulatory affairs. The shortest, the most succinct answer to every single question in regulatory affairs, there are no exceptions, every single question is it depends. It drives engineers nuts. I started out as an engineer. I still fundamentally think of myself as an engineer, but it's not so simple. Guidance is not binding, but again, if you plan on not doing something that's in the guidance, you better have an argument, not as strong as the CFR, but you better have an argument as to why you're not. Anyway, here's why I bring it up. Well, you can read what's on the slide if you want. Guidance documents don't create or confer any rights on any person to operate or bind FDA or the public. I mean, we all know that. The reason why I bring it up here is because where does the content of the guidance come from? Most people think it comes from FDA. Not so much. The content comes from us. What we do at FDA, when we get some new submissions coming in, we take a look at the first few submissions and we kind of take a look and see what sections of those submissions do we really like. And we put those out into the guidance. So when I hear my friends from industry, and I spend most of my time working in industry, complain about what's in the guidance, sometimes what I do is I turn it right around on them and say, you know what, I understand, to quote a famous politician, I feel your pain. But chances are you have nobody to yourself but to blame. Because that stuff comes from us. Okay, so how can we use this to our advantage? What if you are one of the first bringing a product onto the market, and there is no guidance yet? And by the way, I love working in areas where there is no guidance, because that is a huge opportunity to me to do what I think needs to be done. A huge opportunity. So it gives me the opportunity to set the path. So let's say, not so hypothetical, I've done this many times, but I have to, for obvious reasons, be really careful what I say. Let's say that I can design a test methodology that will kind of favor my product while at the same time make it a little more difficult for my competitor to meet that test. Whether it's a benchtop test, an animal test, a human clinical test, I don't care. Philosophically, they're exactly the same. And if that gets into the guidance, see what I've just done? I have used that guidance to my advantage. Now, how can you prove such a thing? Well, most people would say it would be impossible to prove. How could you prove that that test got in there because of something that you did? Well, to test this, on a few occasions over the years, and again, I have to be really careful what I say, we have described some test methodologies, and we used some, shall we say, grammatically awkward phrases. Not grammatically incorrect, but awkward. Long story short, those awkward phrases showed up in the guidance. Is it coincidence? Perhaps. You think about it. Escape, please. So to wrap this up, because we're almost out of time, competitive regulatory strategy when it comes to combination products, that's a whole other bailiwick, and that could be the topic of a whole other presentation. I spend a lot of my time working on combo products, and when you talk about combining, for example, the orphan and the 510K, or the NDA and the HDE, I mean, why the heck do you limit yourself just to the plain old vanilla sort of, kinds of things that most people do? So let me just end with a few final thoughts, and then if we have any questions for Q&A, I would be more than happy to talk about them. So first link, Angel, Discovery. No, not that one, sorry. At the bottom. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. Discovery is seeing what everybody else has seen and thinking what nobody else has thought. It is easy to read the regulation and to understand it and interpret it and implement it the way 500,000 people have done with the same regulation before you. The real challenge is to read the same regulation that everybody else has been reading and interpreting in the past and see it in a way a little different that you can use it to your advantage. Escape, please. The next one, MacArthur. This is one of my favorite for regulatory audiences, as you'll see. Don't just follow the rules, think. MacArthur said, rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to hide behind. You can imagine the reaction that I get when I show a slide like this at RAPS. They're not keen on that, right? But if you don't like it, yell at MacArthur. I'm not the one that said it. I just think it's interesting. Anyway, rules are mostly made to be broken and are too often for the lazy to be hide behind. Let me be crystal clear on this. If following the rules the way that people have been doing it in the past works to my advantage, then I will be the very first ones to do it. And as a matter of fact, I will hit the folks on the other side of the table over the head with 72-point PowerPoint font, saying, hey guys, we're doing exactly the same thing that people did before me. End of discussion, let's go home. But if following the rules doesn't make sense in my particular situation for whatever reason, I will be the first to try a different path. Escape? And the third one, Michelangelo. Michelangelo said, the greatest danger for most of us is not that our aim is too high and that we miss it, but that it is too low and we reach it. I'm the first to admit I set the bar very high. And I won't apologize for that. I believe that if we set the bar higher, we'll achieve more. It's as simple as that. Whether we're talking in medicine and regulatory affairs and, dare I say, politics. But if we set the bar so low that we just about trip going over it, what have we accomplished? Where are you folks aiming? Are you setting the bar high or are you setting it low? Escape? The next one, imagination. Here's one of my favorite ads. If you can think it, we can do it. I really believe that. I really believe that nothing is impossible. The impossible just takes a little longer. Here's a quote from Albert Einstein, very smart guy, much smarter than me. They say if you're going to steal, steal from the best, so I steal from Einstein. Imagination is more important than knowledge. For while knowledge points to all there is, imagination points to all there can be. I really believe that. I really hope that in the last few minutes I've given you a heck of a lot more than just some knowledge about regulatory pathways and bringing some products to market, even in innovative or different ways. I've gotten you to spark your imagination a little bit, maybe ask some questions that you haven't asked in the past, because after all, Einstein also said that logic will get you from A to B, but imagination can take you anywhere. And I really believe that. I started out in this industry 20-odd years ago as an R&D guy. R&D folks are at least encouraged, or supposed to be encouraged, to think outside the box. Regulatory folks, not only are they not encouraged to think outside the box, they're actually discouraged from thinking outside the box. I find that personally very, very troubling, because I believe that there's just as many opportunities to think outside the box in regulatory, perhaps even more, than there are in R&D. But most people don't see it that way. I mean, I tell the people that are working for me, for example, I want them to be wrong a lot. Every once in a while, I want them to be right, but I want you to be wrong more often than you're right. Why? Because if you're wrong, I know you're taking a risk. And if you've never been wrong, you've never taken a risk. Imagine the VP of regulatory or clinical at some, pick your favorite medical device company, saying to his or her regulatory team, hey folks, I want you to be wrong. I could be wrong, but I don't think that's going to happen. I think that's very unfortunate. Because this fellow from my part of the world likes to say, perhaps imagination is only intelligence having fun. I'm not saying that I'm intelligent by any means, just ask my wife. But I like to have fun. Perhaps imagination is intelligence having fun. Escape, and then actually that'll be it. So just as a reminder, if you have, if you would like a copy of the handout and/or the podcast that will go along with this, connect with me on LinkedIn and/or give me your card. At this point, we're about out of time, which is pretty good for me, actually. I'm happy to stick around with questions or comments. I'm happy to get into any of this stuff in more detail.